Hello, forensic students. Um, I am excited to share a video with you today. We are going to go through a PowerPoint on fingerprints. So up until this point, we have mainly been talking about crime scene investigation as a whole. So we went through the history of crime scene investigation. We talked about crime scene investigation practices, different roles that crime scene investigators have and what they do. We talked a little bit about types of evidence and how evidence is collected as we went through our packet. Now we're going to start talking about very specific topics within crime scene investigation. So our first topic is going to be fingerprints. I love talking about fingerprints. It's a fun unit. I'm really hoping you guys enjoy it. I'm going to try to video myself doing some labs. So we're going to fume for fingerprints. I'm going to dust some surfaces for fingerprints and show you hopefully what that looks like next week when I can get back into my classroom. We, as teachers, are allowed to go to our classrooms when there's a very few people in the building, so we have to schedule our time. But I'm hoping next week to get some videos for you guys, and that'll be super fun. Today, we're going to start this PowerPoint. I will actually upload the whole PowerPoint to the LMS. However, there isn't we're going to only go through it a few slides at a time because I don't want you to be watching large videos. So this will be about a 10-minute video or so. We're going to talk through kind of the history of fingerprints and talk about what is a fingerprint and how they develop on your fingers, and then we're going to talk about a few basic characteristics of fingerprints and types of fingerprints. So I'm excited to get going with this. I'm sharing my screen with you, so you should be able to see the fingerprints. This is actually this book here up in the top right corner. That's the textbook that I have. I know we don't have a full classroom set, but I'm going to actually use some of these resources because we're now online. And yeah, I'm excited to get going. So after this whole PowerPoint, which won't all happen today, but after the whole PowerPoint, I want you to be able to discuss the history of fingerprinting, describe the characteristics of fingerprints and fingerprint minutiae, explain when and how fingerprints form, describe how fingerprints can be left on objects, identify the basic types of fingerprints. I want you to be able to describe how criminals alter their fingerprints or attempt to alter their fingerprints. I want you to be able to determine the reliability of fingerprints as a means of identification. We've actually already talked about that. If you remember the PBS Nova that we watched at the beginning of the semester, where the one guy was actually accused of the crime, the bomb in Spain, because of a fingerprint when it was falsely identified. It was wrong. So that can happen. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to describe APHIS, which is the fingerprinting system. We're going to explain how fingerprint evidence is collected, describe the latest identification technologies, and I have a video to show you actually about, it's a TED Talk of the future of fingerprinting, and it's pretty cool. It gets down to the molecular level. And then we're going to talk about and determine if a fingerprint matches a fingerprint record. So I'm going to give you pictures of fingerprints and have you like match them up. And then use the process of lifting a latent fingerprint. Now, I would have had you do that in class if we were at the school, but I'm going to do it for you via video, and I'm going to tell you guys some possible ways you can do it as well at home. So, okay, here we go. First of all, we're going to talk about the history and development of fingerprints. So, if you remember from when we did our timelines at the very beginning of the semester, I talked about that book that came from the 3rd century BC in China. And it had some documents in there talking about fingerprints, but not necessarily as a form of identification. It just kind of talked about the fact that they were there. In ancient Babylon, fingerprints were found on clay tablets as a form of identifying a contract. So instead of like signing your name, they would just use their fingerprint, which is kind of cool. In 1684, Dr. Nehemiah's paper described the patterns on humans' hands. So remember, he was the guy who started saying there is such a thing as fingerprints. We can see them on hands, and there's the presence of those ridges. And then in 1788, Johann Mayer noted that the arrangement of ridges is individual. It's not replicated between people. So everybody has unique fingerprints. And then in 1823, Jean Evangelist Perkin described 9 different fingerprint patterns. William Herschel began the collection of fingerprints, if you remember correctly. We talked about him already. And he noted that no matter how old a person was, their fingerprints didn't change. In 1883, Bertillon created a way to identify criminals that were repeat offenders. And in 1888, Galton and Richard Henry developed the fingerprint classification system, which we still use today. In 1891, I don't know how you say that, Busatich collected all 10 fingerprint impressions, and he actually made measurements and noted those. In 1896, Sir Henry, with two colleagues, created a system that divided fingerprints into groups. All 10 fingerprints are imprinted on a card, and that's called a 10 card. This is what a 10 card looks like. As you can see, you have every single finger, and then you have all four fingers. I had to do a 10 card when I was becoming a foster parent. So one of the first things that you have to do as part of your background check is get fingerprinted. So you have to go to like a special location, and then they do this. I don't know if you can see. Let's see if I can get it using my hand. Okay, so you have to do this thing where you like carefully put each finger just like this. They're really picky about it, and it costs a lot of money. So from now on, my fingerprints are recorded forever in history, but that's okay. Your fingerprints are left everywhere you go, so it's kind of hard to get away from. All right, so let's talk about what these fingerprints are. All your fingers, toes, feet, and palms are covered in these ridges. These ridges are what help us grip objects. So when you pick something up, like I'm holding my coffee cup here, the ridges are actually helping you hold it. If your hands were completely smooth, it would be harder to hold things. Your ridges are arranged in connected units, and we call them dermal ridges or friction ridges. Fingers accumulate natural secretions in dirt. Okay, so they you pick up dirt as you go all over the place, and then you sweat, and your body secretes stuff, right? Fluid, and then you leave that place as oils, specifically in your hands. And then you create these prints on everything that you touch. So if we were at school right now, probably what I would do is have you guys touch your desk, okay? And then we would actually dust for fingerprints and see that you've all left fingerprints all over your desks all year long. So let's look at this picture. This is a structure. This is the skin. Okay, this is a pretty simplified picture, but it shows you that you have your first layer of skin we call the epidermis, and then below that you have a layer of cells. As you can see, I'm pointing that out with my mouse here. That layer of cells is called the basal layer, and then below that we have the dermis. Okay, so the three that you need to remember are the epidermis, the basal layer, and the dermis. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so the inner layer is the dermis, the outer layer is the epidermis, and like I showed you, the basal layer is in between those. And the basal layer actually grows faster than the layers above it. And so then what happens is because it's growing faster, those cells are pulling on the other layers, and it causes it to fold up and form intricate shapes. Fingerprints begin forming in the 10th week of pregnancy. So really, really early on, you developed your fingerprints. We characterize fingerprints in we put them in three categories. So we have arches, whorls, and loops. And as you can see, arches make up about 5% of fingerprints, whorls make up about 30% of fingerprints, and loops make up about 65% of fingerprints. So again, if we were at school, I would have you guys actually use ink and put your fingerprints on a piece of paper, and then tell me what fingerprints, what types of fingerprints you have on your hands. I actually might have you guys do this next week, is if you have ink at home. So we'll talk about that more. We'll talk about that more on Monday when we Zoom. All right, so characteristics of fingerprints. There are three main characteristics that forensic scientists are going to look at when identifying fingerprints. The first one is the core, and the core refers to the center of the characteristic. So if it's a loop, it's going to be the center of the loop. If it's a whorl, it's going to be the center of the whorl. And as you can see, that is the blue circle right here is showing you where the core is. All right. Then deltas are these little triangular formations, and they form around loops and whorls, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later, but they look like a little tent or a little triangle down here. And then the ridge count is actually the number of ridges that you have between the core and the delta. All right. And this is what distinguishes one fingerprint from another. So if I was looking at a fingerprint of my thumb and a fingerprint of my son's thumb, I think we both have loops on there. But my core is located at a slightly different location. I think it's further up on my thumb than his. And then my delta is further away. So there's more ridges in between the core of my fingerprint and the core of Owen's fingerprint. So um, yeah, so they can be different. They're different for every person. All right, but that's a good way to identify um, one fingerprint from another. We're going to learn about a whole bunch of different minutia patterns as well, and those are other characteristics that we can use to identify one fingerprint from another. All right, you guys, this is as far as we're going to go today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Um, if you have any concerns, please feel free to text me or email me. We can talk about them. I don't have a specific assignment for today. I just wanted you to read through this and take some notes. If you need to go back and review anything, I will have a quiz on this towards the end of the unit. So be prepared to understand and know this material. All right, you guys, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.